So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second of the Water Institute's March Water Talks. So last week we enjoyed a very lively discussion given by John Small, and we're also looking forward to a very stimulating talk today. I'd like to take the opportunity here to also remind you that the last one of the March Water Talks will be next week. It will be given by Dr. Sheila Olmsted from the University of Texas. But this afternoon, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Charles Vörösmarty. So Dr. Vörösmarty is currently a professor within the Department of Civil Engineering at the City University of New York. Prior to moving to New York, Dr. Vörösmarty was a faculty member at the University of New Hampshire, where he was founder and director of the Water Systems Analysis Group. At the City of New York, or the City University of New York, Dr. Vörösmarty is leading the Environmental Crossroads Initiative, which focuses on facilitating interdisciplinary collaborations to address pressing and emerging socio-ecological challenges, such as coping with climate extremes, feeding the world's growing population, establishing energy security, while preserving ecosystem services and biodiversity, protecting human health, and sustaining economic development. Dr. Vörösmarty is best known for the development of computer models and spatially distributed data sets, which he then uses in synthesis studies of the interactions amongst the water cycle, climate, biogeochemistry, and anthropogenic activities. His studies are built around local, regional, and continental to global scale modeling of water balance, discharge, material fluxes in river systems, and the analysis of the impacts of large-scale water engineering projects on the water cycle. As just one example, he has spearheaded the development and analysis of databases on reservoir and dam construction worldwide and how they generate downstream coastal zone risks and global threats to human water security and aquatic biodiversity. Dr. Vörösmarty serves on an impressive array of national and international committees, panels, and programs. Among others, he is the current co-chair of the Global Water System Project within the International Council for Science's Global Environmental Change Programs. He has acted as a consultant to the 24th Agency United Nations World Water Assessment Program and represented the International Council of Scientific Unions at the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development. At the national level, Dr. Vörösmarty serves on the United States Arctic Research Commission, NASA's Earth Science Subcommittee, the National Research Council Committee on Hydrologic Sciences, the National Research Council Review Committee of the United States Global Change Research Program, and the National Science Foundation's Arctic System Science Program Committee. So we're very pleased today to have such an impressive scientific leader and visionary as Dr. Vörösmarty as our speaker. And his lecture today will be entitled Water in the 21st Century, Sources of Pessimism, Sources of Optimism. And this is a title, of course, that speaks to every one of us in the Water Institute as we aspire collectively and individually to contribute to the sources of optimism. And so with no further delay, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that very nice introduction. And I have to correct probably what our administrative staff sent you, because the tense on that has changed. I'm not doing all that at once. It's been spread out over a few years, so we'll have to check our verbs a little bit better. So I guess this is the third in the series of Water Talks. I thought money talks, and actually this will set me up for an important lesson that we'll go over during the talk. And I think I pull this down and my lecture will begin, right? Okay. So we're going to talk about water in the 21st century. We're all in the 21st century. I should probably proudly set up next time a picture of my new granddaughter, who it just dawned on me when I saw, I think it was Time Magazine, where it said the child of the future is going to be living to about 130 years old, potentially. And so now I think about all the scenarios I've run into the future, and I always cut it off at about 2075 or 2100. Now it dawns on me that my granddaughter might actually live past our scenarios, which to me, I'm still trying to grasp that. I don't know what to do with that quite yet. But anyway, I'd like to really thank my hosts for inviting me here. I was at the Canadian Water Network meetings in Ottawa, which is also very, very stimulating, interesting. gathering. I'm sure you know many of the colleagues because I guess it sits next door to you here. And to your collective credit, this is a really interesting and I find very heartening, optimistic view of educating the next generation of water scientists that are going to have to deal with the stuff I'm going to tell you about. Problems not going to go away, folks. I'm going to try to highlight some sources of optimism, and I like to say, I'll give you the bottom line, I'm cautiously pessimistic is the way I would like to say it. Most people say they're cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously pessimistic, and perhaps you'll agree with me by the end of my discussion. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an advertisement for my new gig. As mentioned in the introduction, I was at the University of New Hampshire for virtually my entire professional career, so from 1977 to 2008, 32 years, where I worked as described on a variety of Earth system science issues. My new gig is at the City University of New York, which I'm proud to announce has approximately 5 times the population in our student body of your city of Waterloo. We have about 500,000 students, and it's the size of a small country. It's bigger actually than Iceland, and I once told the president of Iceland at great personal risk because he was upset when I told him that. But anyway, our mission here is probably as many missions of environmental think tanks, if you will. We talk about sustainability. We talk about addressing 21st century challenges. We talk about interdisciplinarity and the need to not silo ourselves and really talk across both the natural sciences and the humanity and social sciences and the economic sciences and the legal aspects of many of the questions that we're looking at. So this is not much different than I'm sure you'll see in the mission statements of other such organizations. However, the little, I guess, unique feature of what we're trying to do is we're trying to take what normally could be a lot of hand-waving and a lot of conceptual thinking and to try to really bring it down to earth with as much quantitative information as possible. And these little iconic symbols here show the kinds of things that I and my team are trying to build at the City University of New York. And we're also joining forces. We're in the top floor of this building, so we have about 20,000 feet of space. About half of it's devoted to laboratory and remote sensing facilities. And we're joined on the other floors by people who study nanotechnology and photonics and structural biology and neurobiology. And we've been charged with cross-fertilizing. And so I've already had some really, really interesting discussions, particularly with the nanotechnology people, on how one could create these new sensor systems that could be easily replicable, potentially biodegradable, so you can put it out there in the environment, look at it, see what it tells you, and then it will slowly but surely disappear and not pollute the environment. So this is what I'm up to now, and I guess my new reset button. I'm, I guess, pulling an Al Gore. I'm kind of reinventing myself after a failed presidential run. Okay, now that first the first image is that of the Earth. And you know, our Earth is called the blue planet, and it's called the blue planet for good reasons. There's a lot of water on this planet. And I'm from New York City, and as I explained in my previous lecture at the CWN meetings, I want to give you some relative notion about the fresh water that's distributed across the planet. And I'm going to be talking a lot about river systems of the planet, because that's where we as humans get most of our sustainable, renewable water resource. You know, we use groundwater certainly, but it's mostly coming from near surficial water, often expressed as river flow. So what I do as a kid who grew up in New York City, and I will continue to do till the time I retire, I suppose, is relate things to what every kid in New York City would, the height of the Empire State Building. Okay, now maybe you would do this to you have a tower in Toronto, right? Maybe you've done this as a child yourself. Is it the CN Tower? Yeah. But I do for the Empire State Building, so bear with me, okay? So anyway, this is all the water on planet Earth. And probably most of you know, or if you don't know, you should know, and maybe it should be on your comprehensive exam. About 2.5% of the world's water is fresh water. Okay, and it's easy when you, I don't know how it goes with the Toronto Tower, but in New York City, this is about 100 stories tall, so the math is really easy. So 2.5% of the planet's water, 2.5 floors of the Empire State Building is fresh water. And now we have a little bit of time, so I'm going to tease the crowd a little bit. Okay, so how about groundwaters? How many stories is groundwater? Any guesses? I'll take 2 guesses just to keep it rolling. 2 brave souls.
2 feet.
How much?
2 feet.
2 feet. One more guess. Just yell something. I want to look who said it. One more guess.
1 story.
1 story. Okay. Well, in between. It's 1 human being. So this is all the near superficial groundwaters that we could potentially have access to. It doesn't mean we would use this water because it's either too brackish or polluted or whatnot. But okay, now I'm going to talk about rivers. So if one took a snapshot of the amount of river water there is on the planet Earth, how many stories, or what's the height of the river water on planet Earth? Which is, let me just remind you, the single largest source of renewable water resource. Now we're going to take some guesses. So who wants to start? The bidding. 1 guess from here, 1 guess from the middle, and 1 guess from the right. So this area. Somebody yell out. Any person, anyone who wishes. How deep is that water? How long? A windowsill. Okay. Middle. 1.2 floors. So you're saying the rivers are more water than all of the groundwaters on Earth. But that's a guess. Okay. Next. 1 last guess. The what? The potted plant. Okay. Okay. Well, the windowsill gets the closest. It's actually a thin penny. And you know, if you talk about single drainage basins, if you even talk about the Amazon, you're only taking a slice of that penny, and you know, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the point to be made here is we are on this blue planet, but if we're talking about water, and we're talking about water as the oil of the 21st century, in many cases we're talking about problems and challenges and optimism and pessimism about this little thin penny when you look at it from a global perspective. Okay. All right, so I have some time to dive into this particular study because this is really my starting point. So I asked the question, what's the state of the resource? So back in 2010, we were happy to learn that a manuscript we submitted to Nature was accepted for publication, and it's called The Study on Rivers in Crisis. I'm going to go over what the maps mean in a couple of minutes here. One of the important, to me, benchmarks in my personal career was that a lot of what we talk about as water scientists get drowned out by the global climate change dialogue. And even though water is part and parcel of the climate change question, there's a lot of oxygen pulled into and used for supporting global climate change research. I'm not a climate denier or anything like that. I'm just simply saying the water resource issue itself has had a lot less tangible mileage than has the global climate research effort. And so, tilting at windmills a little bit, I had always hoped that we could begin to articulate the full dimension of the water resource question at the global scale, so we could be toe-to-toe and talk in the same kinds of terms as someone who studies the global climate change question. And part of this also has to do with, again, my kind of development of my personal professional career, is that I've been battling people who study nothing but local scale phenomena for all of my professional life. And they keep telling me there's no value in looking at these global perspectives. And now I think we can begin to have a nice meeting of the minds, and it's very important in my view to have global context. It's very important for local scale analysis to understand what's happening in each and every one of our backyards so that we can intervene and make change. So I'm not against local scale research, don't get me wrong. But I think that it is a multi-scalar problem, and I think you'll see evidence for why it's multi-scalar. And it's not one or the other. And by the same token, the same people I'm arguing with about whether this is valuable or not, and who do local scale studies, I always ask them, well, do you study the orbital architecture of the water molecule in PChem terms in order to answer your questions about a local watershed? And of course, they say no. So if you ask the right questions, I think it's completely valid to look at the global scale, to look at the regional scale, to look at the watershed scale, to look at the plot scale, to look at the bench scale. Okay. All right, so this is my first, I guess, bit of pessimism, I suppose. And I'm sorry that some of the fonts didn't translate. We tried our best, but they didn't. So let me tell you what this map shows. So this map is turn of the century, year 2000 circa. And what we've done is we've created these maps of threats to the inland water systems, in particular the rivers of the globe. The maps are intuitive, so red means high threat under a lot of pressure. Green less so, and blue means not too much of a problem, as best we can tell. The way these maps were generated, and it's a single relative scale from 0 to 1, okay? It's really derived from the conjunction of many different stressors that our local scale studies and our regional scale studies have proven will have a negative or an impactful influence on water systems, either for the aquatic life that lives in these water systems or for the water resources that we use. So you might imagine then that if we were able to assemble global data sets, which we did, of poor land management and watershed stewardship, and we put those data sets together and we combine them with several pollutant data sets that were global in scale, and, for example, data sets that show the overuse of water or the overbuilding of reservoirs. And you don't see it here, but also biotic factors like the introduction of exotic species into waterways. The sheer force of putting all that together and coming up with some math to weight it in different ways, we come up with this map. And so the first thing we checked was China and India. And we patted ourselves on the back because those of us who have visited China and India know that those water systems are under great stress. The literature is filled with all sorts of reports of these maladapted systems. And we thought, wow, that's pretty good. And then we kept looking at this map, and then we saw some surprising elements to it. The first was that a place like Europe or the United States, and Canada is not immune to this, we see a lot of red. And we figure, well, how could this possibly be? Europe has a framework directive on protecting its waterways. It's got an educated population. It's engineering, in a sense. Water engineering grew up in that part of the world, in a sense. And people should know better. And there's a lot of pressure on politicians to do something about the environment. We couldn't quite understand why would that be. And yet we looked at the literature, and sure enough, these systems are under stress. In the United States, recent survey data from the EPA shows that, for example, about 208 million people actually live within 10 miles of an impaired waterway, and 1/3 of the surveyed waterways are under severe impact. And this is in a place where you don't expect this to happen. This is a rich country. And so we began to look at this in a little bit more detail, and it's overwritten by these fonts that fell off the screen here. But we concluded that these threats are a simple, and I would say a sloppy byproduct of our quest for economic development. So wherever you have a lot of people, wherever you have industrial agriculture, wherever you have industry and economic development, whether it's developing like in China or India, or it's well developed like in the OECD countries in Europe and the United States, parts of Australia as well, this is just a byproduct of development. If you stack up all those data sets, you come to the conclusion that it's the aggregate impact of all this stuff together. And I would also like to make, I guess, the provocative statement that these maps, to my mind, provide us, as best we're all trying to do something different, and as loud as we scream about this, this is prima facie evidence for all of the good water management kinds of strategies we would like to promote. That's not been adopted broadly and globally. So integrated water resource management is still quite literally a global aspiration for the 21st century. We should have done this last century, but this is really showing us that a lot of this just is not coming to bear in terms of the reality of the situation. and there's lots of legacy effects from the last century of pollution and maladaptive thinking, and I'll come back to that legacy effect in a couple of minutes. Okay, now, that's the background resource. Okay, so those are the resources that we must gain our sustenance from. So we draw our water supplies from those kinds of impaired systems. And clearly there are clean water supplies tucked away in those red areas, but by and large it's overwhelmingly red in these developed areas. Now, that's the resource that humans rely on. But that's also the place where aquatic biodiversity lives. And one of the sad, pessimistic byproducts of development, we're able to develop and give humankind a better life. A human well-being has improved because of the kinds of water engineering that we institute and the fact that there is economic development. However, there's collateral damage, and that collateral damage we see in the aquatic biota. And this graphic here really should give us some pause. So for the described number of species on a per area basis for marine, land, and freshwater systems, that's the line here. Freshwater systems, ecosystems, are extremely biodiverse. And they're extremely biodiverse because they have all sorts of endemic life forms that in some sense are trapped in a relatively constrained world of aquatic freshwater ecosystems. There's not much in the way of freshwater aquatic ecosystems relative to the area of the ocean or relative to the area of the terrestrial landmass. So they're real biodiversity hotspots, and that's what this line shows in terms of the described species per million square kilometers. On this axis, which are the bars for marine, land, and freshwater system, these are the imperiled species per unit area. And it pretty much follows the species distribution on a per area basis. And in terms of comparison to the extinction rates that we anticipate for marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems have orders of magnitude, perhaps 1,000 times more species imperilment or species loss than does the marine environment. And for those of you who follow this little debate about whether the Holocene should be renamed the Anthropocene because of the impact of humans, if you talk to a paleontologist, they're going to talk about the rapid change in species assemblages, okay? And you could debate whether that's happening because of climate change and all. You could debate whether it's happening in the marine or the land system. But boy, it's hard to debate whether the Anthropocene is not already arrived in the freshwater domain. I would argue that it's the first place to look for the Anthropocene signature if you're a paleontologist looking for species change. Okay. Now, so development seems to be the global imperative. Okay, and what does that mean in terms of the way we do our water business? Well, you don't have to travel far, I'm sure. I don't know exactly where your closest reservoir or dam is. I don't think I have to go very far, based on some of the talks I heard in Ottawa. We have very highly engineered systems, in particular in the developed world. We have big reservoirs. We have big irrigation works. We have big interbasin transfers. We have large irrigation works. Not that irrigation works are a modern feature of the environment. They've been in place for thousands of years. But they are really massive and use tremendous amounts of water. And in fact, the global water crisis, in some sense, is a global water crisis about how much irrigation water we're using to feed ourselves. Okay? And there's, of course, in agroecosystems, you have all sorts of pollution problems, et cetera. And you have all sorts of crazy places where you're trying to grow crops, like in the middle of a desert, where you're tapping into fossil groundwater and it's going to be gone soon, and you're no longer going to have these massive center pivot irrigation works, and they're going to turn the color of the rest of the landscape brown and olive in the not too distant future, because it's not going to pay to pump water from deep down in the ground and get $6 a bushel for whatever you're growing there. It would cost you $12 to pump the water. So anyway, this is what you might term supply side or hard path engineering solutions to these water problems, and they're all over the place. I'm going to show you a map that's sort of fresh off the drawing board, and it's going to be in a paper that a good colleague of mine for a long period of time, and also Hans Duhr, Pamela Green, who we've worked with, is publishing in Global Environmental Change. It's in review right now, but I think it's going to be published soon. And what we did is we tried to create a map, not necessarily of the distribution of impairments kind of in a geographic sense, kind of where independent parts of the Earth are not linked together. We very much linked the different parts of the Earth together through drainage basins. And the map up top is a map of the number of people that are served by the runoff producing areas. So this is trying to take a social science data set, which is the distribution of humankind, the population of the Earth, and match it to where the water sources are coming from, okay? And the way maybe to look at this, to understand it intuitively, is look at a place like the Amazon. Now, if this was a runoff map, if I looked at every little part of the Amazon that produces runoff, it would be the darkest blue on the planet because it's a really, really wet, big drainage basin. 15% of all continental runoff comes off of the Amazon. But now I'm looking at this in terms of the downstream population that is served by the water sources in that drainage basin. And these shades are the number of people, the shadings are the number of people that are served by that upstream water source. And because the Amazon is generally unpopulated, there are not many people who live there. Or for that matter, the high northern rivers like the Mackenzie or the Ob or the Yenisei or the Lenya River basins in the high north, they're basically unpopulated. But these are massive, gigantic runoff machines. But we're not looking at it as a geophysicist would look at the problem. We're looking at it as kind of a social scientist might look at this. So where's the water coming from that serves humankind? And there it is. So the Amazon's not so important, but look at the Himalayas and the Tibetan area, and look at downstream of that where there's lots of runoff producing areas, even where there's lots of agriculture and lots of pollutants flowing into water systems, because the people who live downstream depend on those water supplies because it's packed with people. And they've got the headwaters, for example, in the Ganges Basin, the headwaters of the Himalayas, but they also have many areas that are used for agriculture, used for cities. And all that water is circulating around, and it flows downstream, and it becomes someone else's water source. And we talked a little bit about the Grand River and how there were, 30 wastewater treatment plants? I think that was the number. And I asked, well, how many water treatment plants are drawing from the main stem river that has discharged that wastewater from upstream? Well, there were 2, I think. You said that there were 2 such basins. That's happening all over the world. So this is the resource. Okay, this is just how many people are served by the resource, just in physical terms. Okay, as you might imagine from the last map, we do our best to screw up the systems in the many ways I explained: bad land management, pollution, et cetera, et cetera. And when you take this map and you combine it with how this resource looks with respect to the source areas, where's the water coming from, what's its state of affairs, what color was it in the earlier map, we come up with this kind of map showing that this distribution of water resource turns pretty much red and yellow being high threat scores. These, just take my word for it, it was always intuitive. Red means lots of threat, yellow means less threat. With relatively few areas in the populated world that have blue, the blue is really relegated to these areas like parts of the Amazon and the northern flowing rivers where there's not many people. So and as I mentioned, this conjunction of population and development produces the threat. So you would expect intuitively where there's a lot of people, where there's water flowing to those people, where there's a lot of agriculture, you're producing a lot of red. So what this shows is that the source area of water, serving all of these billions of people, are red or orange, high levels of threat. Okay, now, our propensity here is to fix the situation whenever we can to afford or to secure water for humans, to improve human water security. In order to do that, to fix this, you got to clean things up and you have to make the water reliable at the point of service, okay? So we take this situation and what do we do? And I'm talking in reality, what do we do? In nature, what do we do? We spend about $750 billion a year to remediate, to repair this problem. And in a place like the United States or Europe, guess what? We bring it back to a relatively cleaner state, a much more usable state. The threat on the water systems are much lower. They're blue here, right? So we took areas that used to be red and we turned them to blue. How did we do it? We threw a lot of money at the problem. We threw a lot of concrete at the problem. We threw a lot of chemicals. We threw a lot of piping at the problems, okay? And so we transformed this ambient background level of threat into threat at the point of service. Now, another thing that you can notice about this is that a lot of the Earth, in terms of the people that are this population served, that's what this bar shows, a lot of the Earth is in this yellow zone. We are very incomplete in the way we can bring about human water security for much of the planet, because much of the planet consists of non-rich people who can't afford much of this $750 billion a year. That's really more of a less of a luxury for the OECD nations and maybe some of the rapidly developing parts of the world, like parts of India, parts of Brazil, etc. So this is the situation. I'm really sorry the fonts have blown apart on us here. But in any case, still about 3/4 of the world's population lives in at least moderate levels of human water security threat, despite these big investments, okay? Does everyone get that general notion? I think it's a little different than the way a hydrologist would look at the problem. Okay, so what might the future hold? Now, with a long-standing professional relationship with my good friend Michel Maybeck, who was an advisor to Hans Duhr here, and he actually introduced me and my team to working with Hans. He constructed a time series here of development, okay, where impacts on water systems, at least in a heuristic way, could be mapped out. And Michel Maybeck, if you know of his work, you just study the way Hans here thinks. And we like to put things into categories and typologies and little boxes. This is the way Michel Maybeck has trained us to think through some of these problems. And we kind of laugh at it, but I think they're somewhat useful little boxes. So he talks about stage 1 development where you might be looking at Europe, let's say at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and you're just beginning to create some economic development, but you're also beginning to pollute your environment, okay? And then things begin to accelerate and keep going, and the impact scale keeps growing, and pretty soon you're realizing, oh boy, we're getting richer and richer, but our children are getting sick because of all the pollution, and we begin to do something about that. And after suffering through the situation, you really come to a decision point, like a moment of truth. And again, I'm forced as a New Yorker to use yet another New York metaphor. And I used to be a New York Yankees fan, so I paid a little bit more attention as a kid to this kind of stuff. So back in the day, there was a guy named Yogi Berra who was the catcher for the New York Yankees. And he would say crazy things. And among the crazy things that he said, I can use for this talk. If you come to a fork in the road, take it, okay? And so now you're in a decision point where you're suffering because of you're suffering the fruits of your development, of all the benefits of economic development. Now what do? Do you sustain the impairment? Do you just simply put up with it? Or do you try to do something with it? And Michel Maybeck would say, well, stage 3 is this decision to not do anything, or you have long-term legacy effects that you can't get rid of, like salinity intrusion into the aquifers of the Alsace region of France. That's going to last for hundreds of years. So no matter what they do, they're still going to be here. Or the Rhine, where you begin to really execute investments in trying to fix the problem. Okay, that's proactive rehabilitation. So, so the question for us is, does the curve globally get pushed up? Does it stay high, or does it improve? So what would be pushing, I'm going to push up to the ceiling here. What's pushing it up? What's pushing it down? That curve, okay, in conceptual terms, okay? So let's talk, here's the the pessimistic part of the show, so that I could end on a more optimistic note, I guess. Okay, so here's the pessimistic part. So our good colleague, and Hans and I have worked with this guy, Balázs Fekete, who's in his own right a world-renowned hydrologist, has done all sorts of water budgeting for the planet, and he's collected all sorts of information. And you would think that in this day and age, where we're talking about global water questions, we would have pretty constrained estimate of what we're talking about in terms of water volumes. You would think, we've studied this. I would go back to the classic work of the Russians and the Germans back in the mid-70s, where they looked at the discharge of the Earth, and they disagreed about what the discharge of the planet from the landmass to the oceans were. They disagreed, and you know, bless their hearts, they were doing this basically with crayons and paper, you know. So they're going to be off. I mean, honestly, you can't blame them. But if you follow the history here of these estimates, and we even come across our own here, by the year 1990, they're agreeing with Baumgartner and Reichel. But then there's this crazy paper by a colleague of mine. It's a crazy paper. It's going down to 22,000 units. Less than half, I guess, of what Korzun did with his crayons and magic markers, okay? And then Sandra Postel pops up to 40,000. Wolfgang Grabs with our team talks about 42,000. 2001, 36,000. Balázs Fekete and our team, 38,000. Another Japanese guy, 37, 36, 32, 36. And then all of a sudden, 2011, whoa, models burst back onto the scene, and we get 42 to 66,000. I could understand if we didn't have some kind of observational record, but we do have some observational record, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But that's really sad that we don't even know how much water we're talking about, and we're talking about this as the oil of the 21st century. So this, to me, is a very pessimistic story that the science community can't even tell you how much water is flowing to the world's oceans. Okay, another thing is, and only until very recently, we've been looking at water problems at the national scale, which I believe is the wrong scale to look at because there's a lot of stuff happening subnationally. And in 1997, there was a very influential treatise by the United Nations that was published on the freshwater renewable resources on planet Earth. And they scored nations by how much water use relative to supply was tabulated, I guess, in the 1990s at the time. And the United States gets one color. Alaska gets the same color as the lower 48. I suppose Guam is colored the same as the rest of the US. Canada, big country, gets one color. Brazil, big country. Russia, 8 time zones, one color. You know, it's intuitive. North Africa and Middle East is red. You would understand that. So those are high water users. So what we did is we said, we don't believe that that's the case. We just don't believe that that's the way to look at the question. So what we were able to do back in the year 2000 is we were able to capitalize on, at that time, these emerging global data sets that allowed us to look at it in pixel space. So we divided the Earth into 60,000 units, not 200 units. And we said, look, you know, you cross from the East Coast to the West Coast of the US, you just look down at the landscape, and there are wet areas, and there are mesic areas, there are dry areas, and then wet areas again. I mean, things are changing, and the water uses are changing along with the supply. You could do the same for Canada. You'd see very similar things. So it becomes a geographic question. So what we said is, let's view this not as a kind of a basic accounting country level assessment. Let's pixelize this. Let's look at it as a GIS question. And what do we come up with? So what we were able to do is we were able to take the estimates of the United Nations from this map, and they had these 4 different colors: low, moderate, medium, high, and high. Right? These are the numerics there. And for their country level, they talked about the billions of people that were under low, moderate, medium, high, and very high stress. That's what their numbers did. And we did our pixel-based analysis, and then we aggregated up to the country scale, and we came up with virtually the same numbers, especially in the highest realm, the red, okay? And they say 0.46 billion, we said 0.45 billion. We're not going to argue with that. Those are pretty much the same numbers, okay? But then we said, all right, that obliterates the value of doing it in a GIS space. What if you preserve the pixels? How many people would you get under, let's say, the highest level? And lo and behold, we more than tripled the estimates made at the country scale by looking at it in, I think, the much more realistic view as a geographic question. It's a geographic question of supply and demand and how that all plays out. And when we came up with these numbers, boy, did we worry about publishing this, because we thought, my God, we're basically taking on the United Nations and saying, you guys are just way off. I mean, we'd have to triple your numbers to get anything close to what would. Bottom line here is we published this, and it was, was recognized that, well, maybe we need to check these new kinds of approaches. And people who have checked us afterwards have actually pointed at us at being somewhat conservative, that they get even higher numbers than we do. And so we worried about whether we should publish this. We were sticking our necks out, academically speaking, and we're wondering who's going to chop it off. But at the end of the day, we were actually on the low end of some of these estimates. So I guess that was a little bit of a game changer. So the point here is that this kind of technology, as it were, is only about 15 years old. So we were looking at the question like this, and I think maybe this should be an optimistic part of the process. But it's still a new way of looking at this, and it's hard to get out of some of these mindsets. Okay. Now, the maps that I showed you really can be also reorganized as a map of, or I should say a graphic summarizing all those pixels, putting them into country bins, and then classifying the countries as poor, or rapidly emerging, or rich countries. And this is exactly what we did. So what we did is we took the pixels for each country, and we put them together, and we expressed this as the wealth per capita. So poor countries are here, moderate income countries are here, rich countries are here. And as I mentioned to you, as a byproduct of development, we would see the background level of red, okay, spread throughout the world wherever it's developed. So we would expect to see threat levels here. This is just basically, I should maybe color code it. This was basically the blue, the greens, and the reds, okay. We saw a rapid increase and a flattening off, sustained red in the developed parts of the world. And remember I said we threw $750 billion at the problem? You could actually take that set of threats and reduce them if you're rich enough. And these purple area, or this purple area here, represents the impact of those investments. So if you're a rich country, you can bring down your threat. If you're a poor country, you can't do much. You live with the threat. That's too bad. You just live with the threat because you don't have the resource, the financial resource to fix it with engineering, the classic hard path engineering. Okay? Now, this is where it is pessimistic, because now, does anyone notice what I did? This is the same graphic. This is the same graphic. I just changed the scale. And the reason I changed the scale is I did a early assessment here of business as usual. What happens if what we see in the past continues into the future? And what we're trying to do here is we're basically trying to simulate the really big gorilla in the room, I think, for water and for a lot of other stuff. It's the emergence of a very large middle class globally. And I'm not saying people should not develop economically. I'm not making that argument. I'm just simply saying if we make that decision, the water systems are going to be under even more stress. And here's what I think happens. So as we begin to make our dreams of economic development come to pass, we realize those dreams, more people are going to be moving to the right. As we saw, as you move to the right, you have more threat, right? And in fact, if you were able to get some of the statistics on the future growth of the middle class, you'd see that we're going to probably reduce the number of really, really poor people, and we're going to create this giant class in the middle that's going to be pumping up these threats. And so remember, the maximum here was 1.0 for the whole Earth in the year 2000. By the year 2030 or 2040, when we see this emerging middle class, we probably are going to be doubling in some income classes that level that we saw back in the year 2000. So this, I think, is sort of the vision of what we might be coming up on in the future. And again, I mentioned there is going to be this rise of the middle class. It's going to benefit millions of people. I'm not going to argue that it's even going to happen. It's probably going to happen. But the cost to fix our water systems, to bring them down to anything near the 2000 levels, is going to be quite expensive. And on top of all that, there's the whole biodiversity issue that I talked about earlier, and the destruction of life. And now, I guess the good thing, it's not all bad news, I mentioned that astute businesses will see the opportunity to rise to the occasion. I'll revisit that in my optimistic part of the talk. Okay, now, I asked the question here, and we talked about legacies as I got a briefing from some of the students a couple of hours ago, and this notion of legacy effects is really, really important because it really sets up the conditions by which we are going to move into the future. And I had the great honor to work with interdisciplinary teams of students who came to our institute, and it included people who did environmental history. And actually, I show the cover of this particular journal because it's one of the premier environmental science journals. And there's an article inside this issue that was on colonial hydrology by a historian. And a historian took 15 others of us onto that paper, and we published this paper in a premier environmental science and technology journal, and he's a historian. And historians are not supposed to work with groups. They're supposed to work alone. And this guy took a little bit of hell from his advisor for taking that personal, professional risk. Historians work alone. Really, they really, really work alone. And they're rewarded for writing monographic books. So for him to get together with 15 people was viewed in some sense as a waste of time. But for us, of course, it's breaking down disciplinary boundaries. And this is a testament to the way we need to do business. Well, anyway, the reason I'm showing this is that we see when we analyze the historical records, and I've been doing it with this guy, we see time and again people have this idea that we come onto water resources, we use them, we abuse them, we screw them up, and then we fix them. So the reason in some sense that we have a $750 price tag on fixing the problems we see today is that the seeds of that kind of thinking were planted centuries ago, and we studied this in terms of the colonial United States. And you know, again, like you would see that in New York City they would settle the southern part of Manhattan Island, and they would, just outside the reach of humans, they would have clean water supplies. But then when the population grew, they despoiled that water supply, and then they had to go north still further, and then they finally went out of the city, and eventually they ran out of frontier. And luckily, by the time they ran out of a frontier, they were able to throw engineering at this particular issue. And guess what we do today? We spend $750 billion on engineering. So I'm just simply saying the patterns and the habits may be hard to break, and we see evidence for what's happening today way in the past. It's nothing. It's basically nothing new in our view. Okay, so there's a lot of inertia here. Okay, and I think that those of you who are geologists, you probably know about Hutton and Lyle, and they said that the present, if you view present-day geological process, that's the key to understanding the past. And I think it's the opposite for water issues. I think that the past is a great indicator of what we're doing in the present and also in the future. And what I just simply like to argue here is this is a century-scale set of curves in terms of withdrawals of water, large dams, inland fishing, nitrogen pollution, and the introduction of invasive species into waterways. I can't believe that this is going to turn around, and again, we scream about this all the time. No matter how loudly I scream, this curve's not dropping down. This curve is not going to be attenuated. This curve is actually going to be increasing, as we'll show in a few minutes. Nitrogen pollution is not going to stop and come down without a long-term process of trying to move this inertia towards a different. It's built into the system. Tell me what process, maybe nuclear winter would do something along these lines. But I can't think of let's say a governance process that would order everyone on Earth to move these curves out. In fact, most decision makers don't even know this stuff is happening. So therefore, my conclusion is more of this is what we will see in the future. I have no other evidence to the contrary, because we are doing today what we've done for centuries. The system, it seems to be accelerating, so why in Lord's name would we be doing anything much different, at least for the next few decades? And if anyone has a good idea about that, please share it with me. I just look at these curves dispassionately and say, well, more of the same. Okay, now why do I also think more of the same? So this is the blueprint for the water sector, and the water sector, as I mentioned, generates $750 billion of annual revenues, a lot of which is to fix problems that we've created, or to invest in new engineering infrastructure where it's not there. And I'm not arguing that people in Ethiopia don't deserve to have water storage, because, you know, my God, of all places on earth, they have very variable climate, they're prone to drought, and if they had some water storage, they might be better able to not have drought and starvation in the future. You know, I'm not going to make that argument. But what I will say is that this blueprint is a hard path blueprint, and this blueprint is for more expensive solutions, stressing hard path engineering. This report makes no mention really of ecosystems, no mention of the word ecosystem services. I think I heard a nice talk today by one of the students, I forget who it was. Right. Aziz? Is Aziz? Yeah, Aziz. Okay. And no mention of biodiversity. And like as this came out in the year 2010, so did our paper in Nature. And we're saying, hey, folks, guess what? All of these activities have an impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. And this is the blueprint for this industry. I mean, they don't have to scream loud. I have to scream loud. They've got money behind themselves. So like I say, money talks, water talks also, I guess, but not as loudly. Okay, so again, I'm not making this stuff up. It would be nice to have shown this as an animation, but you can imagine we've color-coded this into reservoirs that are blue, that are existing, and new hydropower facilities are shown in red. I like to show what happened in the US, because the US has 2 centuries of dam building, and really the animation is really interesting, because you see the westward expansion of the US traced by the number of dams that are being put there. We have now about 80,000 dams, registered dams in the United States, and we're pretty much finished building dams, because there's no more space to build prime dams without enormous cost or environmental regulation or pushback by the population. But there's lots of places where you could put dams in the developing world, and there are lots of places that need to develop, and there are lots of places that could benefit from so-called green technologies, and hydropower is considered a green technology. And so guess where there's going to be a lot of action, like there was over 200 years in the United States and in Europe, but now it's going to really take place in the future in terms of planned or under-constructed reservoirs. A lot of these are actually being built right now. And I think the total is something like 2,800 or 3,000, something along those lines, to be built in the next 15 to 20 years, with a 73% increase in global capacity of hydropower. And of course, you know, you're not going to argue with this. If economic development is in our future, hey, this is a way to economically develop. But of course, what does that do to biodiversity and ecosystem services? That's a question. Okay, so the inertia is one legacy. Okay, another legacy is that of governance and human decision making. I was really tickled to be working with historians, because I learned stuff that I never would have even thought happened. I come from the northeastern U.S., and I don't come from the West. And for those of you who know the United States, dams like the Hoover Dam out west are the real symbol of the New Deal, and Roosevelt getting us out of the Depression with these big, giant public works projects. And he pranced across the West, and there were very sympathetic years. You know, they needed to secure water supply in a relatively parched part of the country, and didn't get as much pushback as he got when he came with that notion to the east. And he had these plans to produce these large reservoir facilities, and he made the mistake of essentially planning a reservoir that was going to flood this place called Newfane, Vermont. And Newfane, Vermont was the hometown of this guy, who was the governor of Vermont, George Aiken. And he said, over my dead body, you're coming in here and putting a reservoir in here. which could have had benefits in terms of flood mitigation or hydroelectricity supply, okay? And guess what? This guy got some of the other governors from the region and say, nope, nothing to do. We're not going to have these big reservoirs like you have out west. We're going to maintain our lifestyle, and we don't need this. We're going to do something else. Well, I live in the Northeast. The Northeast is a really highly developed part of the country. Well, we need energy, right? So if you're not building reservoirs, what are you doing? Well, the legacy that we've got to live with is that because of these guys battling it out in the 1930s, we have to deal with all sorts, not this, but we have to deal with thermoelectric power plants, pretty much because these objects were pretty much off the table, the big ones at least. And so we are now in a different position than the West, which has a lot of hydro. We have a lot of thermal. And thermal, well, it replaces the need for hydroelectric power, but it does so with the need to cool the turbines of these systems. So now we have a thermal pollution question that we've got to deal with, especially with the specter of climate change. So if greenhouse warming means warmer water, meaning perhaps less cooling water to run these plants. And so, so that's a legacy effect. Another problem in all this is we're not really talking the same language, even among the scientists and then also the practitioners, okay? And I was part of a team, I actually led a team at the National Academy to look at this issue of extreme hydrology. So the big concern with climate change is that we might have more extreme floods and more extreme droughts. And a guy from NASA, one of the program managers, challenged us to say, well, what is there consensus about that? Does everyone think that there'll be more hydrologic extremes like floods and droughts? And I brought together a team of people who were atmospheric physicists and climate experts and hydrologists. And we all kind of agreed that, yeah, the consensus was that, with climate change, the evidence seems to be pointing in that direction. But then the agreement began to disintegrate because the ways in which the hydrologists and the climatologists talk to each other, like climatologists would talk to the number of days with extreme rainfall more than 50 millimeters per day in a month, that trend over 30 years. And the hydrologists talk about the 100-year flood. Well, they couldn't really quite match up to what they were saying. And then the two groups couldn't quite match up to what the practitioners needed. So we brought people from the Army Corps of Engineers there and from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And they said, hey guys, tell us what we need to do so we could plan the next nuclear power plant. And they couldn't really tell them much because they didn't have the same nomenclature and the kinds of certainty that the practitioners were looking for, the climate scientists and hydrologists could not give them. So that's, I think, a source of pessimism. Okay, now the other thing is, this is similar to the curves that I showed you before, with the addition of McDonald's restaurants. Okay, so this has been one argument why we have to call the Holocene the Anthropocene, because pretty soon, we're just going to be dominating the whole planet. But the real point here is this inset. At the time when all this stuff is accelerating, all of it's going up, some of it's accelerating like really exponentially. If you look for water at the flow monitoring in the UN-designated repository at the Global Runoff Data Center, this is the year 1900, the year 2000. We know more about flow off the continents in the year 1982 than we do today because countries are not sharing the data sets anymore. And if we look at water use reporting, there's a shorter record and it peaks a little bit later, but it comes crashing down. Countries are not reporting the amount of water that they use. So if water is the oil of the 21st century and all this kind of stuff is happening, why are these curves going down? And that's, I think, a big question to our policymakers. To me, it's baffling. And even if you're concerned only about the climate change question, why are you not monitoring one of the most important aspects of climate question, which is water? Why are these curves for monitoring going down? I don't understand that. And it's sort of like metaphorically, stepping on the gas pedal, and here Bob, put this blinder on and step on the gas, and we're stepping on the gas, and I don't quite get why that's happening. But anyway, factors reducing threat. Now I pass to my optimistic part of my talk. Okay, so there are innovators, and I talked about astute businesses having an opportunity here. And there's a guy who was following some of the work that we were doing, and Hans, I think you were part of some of this work on the reservoirs and the sediment fluxes and things like this. At one point you were, I think. And this guy surveyed the literature, astute businessman, business person, looked at the literature, and he discovered a global scale analysis, which we did, on the trapping of sediment behind the world's reservoir systems. And we made the point that, number one, it reduces the useful lifetime of reservoirs. If it's filling up with sediment, you're no longer using it to generate hydro, and it's less storage for irrigation or municipal water supply. And guess what? You trap in sediment, the sediment doesn't get to the coastal zone, and the coastal zones of the world, including deltas, can't keep up with sea level rise because they're not being nourished by the sediment that they need to be nourished by. So this guy said, wow, I thought it was just a German problem. And he had no idea until he started looking at the literature that we're saying that it was a global problem. And so, again, I would point to the notion of doing global work is actually worthwhile, because this guy instantly saw that the 5 or 10 sub-state regions of Germany that he was trying to sell his product in could now be global in domain. And so I've had really interesting discussions with him. It's a really elegant system where he takes these sediments that were deposited, and he has this flotation system, and he pumps it, and he gets it to the effluent point. So they're normally deltas that once the rivers hit these big quiet lakes, they actually produce deltas where they come in from upland, and then they deposit all these sediments, and these sediments are just unconsolidated. They're flocculated in some cases, and you could very easily just withdraw that and pump it to the right place near where it can be discharged, and it revitalizes the sediment flux in the river. And it's a really brilliant idea, and the guy was inspired by, of all things, a global map, which I always produced for academic purposes. I never produced it for business purposes. The other thing is, if we have bad habits, you can find them in many parts of the earth. I was hearing about these irrigation works that I think only recently have been abandoned in Saudi Arabia, where they're actually trying to grow, or they were trying to grow wheat in the middle of the desert, and they were tapping into their aquifers, and they were getting saltwater intrusion, and then they were thinking of using their great energy wealth to desalinate the water and pump it back into the ground and clean it up and use it again for the irrigation, and that just doesn't make any sense. What might make better sense is to use the law of economic comparative advantage and let and again, you'd have to do this with good governance structure so that no one's cheating, and you would do this with sustainability in mind, but maybe you could rely on the global marketplace to reshuffle areas that are producing foods that require a lot of water and ship it to places where you shouldn't even be thinking about trying to grow fruit because you don't have the water. And again, we'd argue about whether the marketplace would distort that or if there are tariff issues. But if you had a fair broker to kind of figure this out, it might be a way to actually relieve much of the stress on the global water system, because much of the stress is having to do with irrigation for agriculture. Okay. Now, also in the spirit of optimism, I have been working with some people in the Northeast region to try to find win-win situations. Okay, so one of the things that is kind of interesting is that we are under a transition period now in the Northeast, and you have all heard of fracking, of course. And fracking, as much as you might not like it for a variety of reasons where the water's getting fracked, you might love it from the standpoint of what happens where the gas is being used, in particular to produce electricity, because you can use it for dual cycle gas-powered thermoelectric facilities with very high efficiencies and very little thermal pollution. And some states are actually going in that direction, where they're trying to reconvert their high-polluting carbon and thermally polluting coal plants into this dual cycle gas. So anyway, one of the experiments we did is to say, okay, we have this Clean Water Act in the United States where for the protection of aquatic habitat, you have to close the plants down if the discharge effluents, thermal effluents, get too hot, because it's going to shock the fish and kill the fish. So what we did is we gathered up information, and for year 2000 to 2012, we produced a time series of the recorded generation by the 384 power stations that we distributed across the Northeast. And we had recorded generation, and this is what we simulated. So we do a pretty good job of getting what the plants are supposed to do. And then we said, all right, that just generates the power system with no shutdowns. And in fact, we discovered that a lot of the plants continue to operate not in violation of the Clean Water Act, but they get waivers. So they continue to thermally pollute because of, let's say there's a heat wave in a city and they got to get people air conditioning. So they'll make the judgment, get the people air conditioning and let the fish deal with it. But if you were to the letter of the law, start turning off the power plants, you would take a big hit, especially in the summertime, with perhaps a 30–40% hit on your regional capacity to produce electricity if you followed the law where you have to turn the plants off to save the fish. Okay. Now, I guess that's bad news for a power company, and it's bad news for consumers because they've got to go out on the spot market, and guess what? We go to Quebec to buy Hydro-Quebec power. So it's good for you guys when that happens as Canadians. But we also discovered that you got to shut the plants off. But guess what? You also could keep other plants going, those blue plants. You can actually keep other power stations going if, by trying to protect the fish, you turn off the most offending of thermally polluting power stations to save the fish. You also save, in some sense, the downstream power plants from their thermal pollution, because these are distributed as the pearls along the river. And just like the wastewater, drinking water question, what happens upstream impacts what's happening downstream. So if you close off one of the big thermal polluters upstream, you could save some power production downstream and still save the fish, which we thought was a true win-win. Okay, other thing is, this I guess is a win-win from the standpoint, if you prevent problems from happening, you're doing a lot better. And I guess I should finish up. Yes, I'm looking at the clock. I should finish up. Okay, so the lesson to be learned is if you prevent the problem from starting in the first place, you might save a lot of cash. So I think the optimism here is that you could express this in really stark monetary terms and catch the interest of the decision makers. Okay, and this is an example I use. This is the Yamatogawa River Basin in the Osaka Prefecture. 1.7 million people live there. It's a 17,000 square kilometer basin. What's the Grand Basin? What's the area? How much? 7,000. So it's twice, 2–3 times bigger. Okay. This is a heavily polluted system. They wanted to use it ultimately for recreation, and they wanted to rehabilitate it for habitat, et cetera. They had literally a 4-decade rehabilitation, and this is the amount of accumulated investments in millions of US dollars, 80,000 million US dollars equals $80 billion. $80 billion to rehabilitate over 40 years a single drainage basin, twice the size of the Grand River, 1.7 million people. Okay, now I don't know. I don't have the math on what it would have cost to protect it, but I don't think it would have cost $80 billion to protect it in the first place. Okay, so anyway, you've already seen this. This is the kind of stuff in this blueprint. Now, is there a way that we could think a little bit more creatively about using what is known as green infrastructure? My hand got slapped by someone who works in a desertic area and works on water policy. Said, what is green? I don't want green. I don't want lawns. She thought green was green infrastructure, you know, of the kind where you plant forests upstream, and that's not going to help you if you're in a desert area where you're starved for water. So let's just say environmentally sound alternatives to the hard path engineering. So whenever you can, use wetlands when you can. Whenever you can, keep forests intact and floodplains intact, because it gives you all sorts of benefit. You can clean water, your water systems, you can protect yourself against flooding, you can create habitat for fish, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what you say, we're in a position now where if we're thinking long term, I'm thinking my granddaughter, My granddaughter I hope she's not going to be paying for this her entire life, because I think it's going to get more and more and more expensive, especially when there's energy involved. If we're coming up on a decarbonized world, I don't know where all the energy is going to come from to build these big systems. Maybe we need to work a little bit more sensibly with nature, and we need to join forces with nature. Okay, and there are the examples. So this is the good news from the standpoint you could explain to someone that there's a 50-to-1 payback on acid rain reduction strategies. You get good water quality that comes out of that, but you also reduce human health costs. You protect the New York City water supply by preventing development. It's a 6-to-1 payback. And it's a 100-to-1 payback in terms of floodplain mitigation instead of building a giant, $3 billion giant reservoir. If you just protect your wetlands in the right way. This number, it doesn't come from me. It comes from, of all groups, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They think that's the way to go. So, there's some enlightenment there. Okay, so I showed you this before. So as a function of wealth, here's what happens with those maps. Here's what happens when you try to fix the problem. The purple is that $750 billion. As I mentioned to you, with the rise of the middle class, we're going to be pushing more and more people to the right. They're getting wealthier on a per capita basis. And population growth is going to be forcing more people into these higher classes. Right? So now what does that look like? You could do it the old-fashioned or the hard path way, and it's going to cost more and more and more. But could we envision, and I don't have the answer, I just have a kind of a theoretical vision of this. What if you, in the face of going to the right and going up, instead of seeing these large increases, could you reduce what's happening out there in the background by just preventing prevent the problem from happening, and improve the management so that you could bring it down to some more manageable level? So just think about this. If you're, instead of having this thing go up to 1, and then having to have all that purple area, which is $750 billion, right? What if you prevented the problem, and this was your starting point instead of it being near 1? If this was your starting point, the area under that curve and the area under this one that I'm imaginarily showing you here is way less. Maybe you could reduce the cost down to $200 billion because you're working with nature. Whoops. You're working with nature, and you're working with the so-called green infrastructure. Okay, now I'm going to do something really brave. I talked about ecosystem services. Okay, I was reading about this as a young Turk. Okay, sorry if you're from Turkey. That's just an expression. I was a young guy, and I was reading this stuff, and because I was asked to read this because my advisor was a student of this guy. And if you're not familiar with this guy, Howard Odum, everyone in this room, honest, read Howard Odum's early work. It's really visionary. He was an ecosystems scientist who did all sorts of energy analysis and just a fabulous thinker. And he talked about energy, ecology, and economics, and I loved this first paper that I read back in '73. And it's many are beginning to see that energy, ecology, and economics form a single unified system. And I found that absolutely 100% inspiring, and I'm going to do something really brave. And you'll see in the next couple of slides here. Here's what else he said. Even in urban areas, more than half the useful work on which our society is based comes from the natural flows of sun, wind, waters, waves that act through the broad areas of seas and landscapes without money payment. An economy to compete and survive must maximize its use of these energies, not destroying their enormous free subsidies. He didn't call it ecosystem services. He called them free public goods and subsidies. The necessity of environmental inputs is often not realized until they are displaced. So the stuff I'm talking about that has happened since he wrote that, I don't know what the price tag on that is. And then he says environmental technology, hard path stuff, right, which duplicates the work available from the ecological sector, is an economic handicap. Okay, and so I drew my inspiration from him, and here's what I did as a brave person. That's the guy who read this. Okay, let's get that off the screen. Okay, now, all right, so this is cool. Everyone likes the idea of using ecosystem services. I was involved many years later in something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it was a taking stock of the state of affairs with respect to where ecosystems were today and in the future, what was their status, and what's the status of the services that come from the ecosystems themselves. And this is a scorecard for impacts. And this is for forests, drylands, inland waters, coastal, marine systems, mountain systems, polar systems. And these are different factors: habitat change, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, nitrogen pollution, etc. And the colors just show how important the impact is on biodiversity. Red meaning lots of impact on biodiversity, low not. And then there are these arrows here that show decreasing impact or increasing impact. If you look very carefully, I think there's only one arrow with decreasing impact, and that's for the temperate zone right here, and in terms of habitat change. And it's because in the Northeast, maybe here in Canada as well, there's been a lot of abandonment of what used to be agricultural land back to forest. It reverted to forest, and we moved agroecosystems to the Midwest and the West. But except for that one, and that's happening in Europe as well, except for that one, all the arrows are going up. They're either going up really fast or they're going up at an angle, and in many cases they're stable, not changing too much. So Howard Odum's vision, and I guess our vision, is to try to tap into these ecosystem services. But this is the report card. It's not looking good for ecosystem services. And I tell you, if you destroy those services, what he didn't mention is that it could be a permanent destruction of those services. And like the species losses that I showed you, that big bar in the inland, once they're gone, they're gone. I mean, you're not bringing them back. You're not rehabilitating the species. They're gone. And whatever benefits they had are lost forever. Okay, so now I have to start really, once again, blow a sour note here on the trumpet, because what's it going to take to change these habits? Well, I was at the Canadian Water Network meeting, and the word governance kept coming up and up and up in all of the discussions. And we really have to do things in a very different way. And I've just tried to present evidence from I guess an Earth system science perspective as to why I think, either because there's inertia or there's just bad habits that we've instituted over centuries, they're going to be hard to break. And I think, when crises occur, and there's a crisis in the Colorado River Basin, there's a crisis in California, and they're going to solve their water problems, but they're going to solve their water problems through innovation, but by the force of the disaster. And we always tend to look in the rear view mirror. We always kind of get ready for the next catastrophe that just happened. I don't think we're going to have planes crashing into the Freedom Tower in New York. I don't think that's going to happen, but something else will happen. And it's just sort of the propensity of people not to really learn from their mistakes, and not to also get out ahead of the problems. We're always looking at what had happened, and we wait for the problems to happen before we fix them. And that's the concept: impair and repair. We screw it up and then we fix it. And I see it throughout the history I've tried to unveil for you. So anyway, this is my last slide. I think it's going to be a battle between literally saving the planet's water systems and how you do it. You can do it through engineering of the traditional type, or you're going to do it by joining hands with engineers and economists and incentivizing really creative ways of trying to create sustainable solutions that don't destroy the long-term value of these systems. The rise of the middle class, I think that's the big gorilla in the room in terms of water systems. We're going to see enormous, enormous impacts. And I know we will, because I've sat in on the debate for the Sustainability Development Goals, and the developed world talks to the developing world as kind of the big brother, say, hey, you have to do this sustainable development stuff where you're thinking ahead and don't destroy the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And the developing world say, hey, we've got all these babies dying of diarrheal disease, and we can't feed our people. We'll deal with that sustainable, ecological stuff later. We just need to get clean drinking water and sanitation for our people. And there's a real schism there. There's a real schism. And it's that developing world that's going to create this new middle class. And that kind of thinking, as I think I've shown you here, is going to create this enormous set of threats. Then to end on a good note, I really do think we've got to bring the business community in here to think about sound alternatives to this and to create incentives, not to just do it because of corporate goodwill. That's not what really drives this. They have to make a profit from this. And this guy who's doing this reconstitution of these sediment budgets in these rivers by this very simple, elegant engineering system, he's got the right idea. He's going to make money. Yeah, that's why he's doing this, really. I mean, he has environmental awareness, but he has the double whammy of being socially conscious about it. But he's going to make gobs of money if he does this right. And we've got to find other ways to engage the private sector so that it could turn this into profit. Because otherwise, I think the battle is going to be with the traditional water sector. It's going to be hard to argue against $750 billion a year, where it pays to screw things up because you can fix it and you get a lot of money to do that. So we really have to work with our engineering brethren to solve this problem together. Okay, so that was my last slide. And there's some additional pieces of information here, and I suggest you take a look at some of these websites. They should hopefully give to you information I have had no chance to give to you because it's too detailed today. And there was a special issue from the Global Water System Project, Water in the Anthropocene. It actually does a pretty good job of summarizing the last 15 years of developments in this arena. And so a lot of what I've said really draws from that kind of experience. And I thank you for your time. I'm sorry I ran over, but we did start a little late, as I noticed. So. Okay, thanks a lot.
Charles, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. I guess my question is about linking that local scale and the global scale and everything in between.
Right.
And so if I was somebody at maybe the local or regional scale,
right,
and I wanted to look ahead by thinking about the global kinds of trends that you were pointing to, what kind of insights would you give me for helping me decide whether or not some of these global trends were relevant at the scale at which I was working?
Right.
Sort of on the assumption that I can't do it all because I can barely do what I'm doing
Yes.
at home, right?
That's a really fantastic question. And there is this tension all the time between those of us who do assessments at the broadest of scale to give local conditions some kind of a metric by which you could measure from 0 to 100. Where do you sit on that ruler, on that scale? And you sit on that scale as any location in very, very unique ways. If you're talking about Canada, you're talking about tar sand issues, right? That are different than talking about Lake Erie pollution issues, that are different than talking about First Nation sanitation, village sanitation issues. So even in the context of a particular country or state or province, every locale has its own unique features to the water question. And all we're trying to say here is that these accumulate, and the decisions you make at the local scale, you're going to try to do the best you can. You're going to try to get the best engineering and maybe best green infrastructure to lower your costs. You're going to try to do the very best that you can, as every locale should. But at the end of the day, if we step back and say, geez, we did what we thought was enough to do, but these guys, these pin-headed academics keep telling us we're not doing enough. And you know something? Together, all of the millions of local scale decisions aren't making much of an impact globally. We have to double up. We have to create even more impetus for doing something better. And as well, let me reiterate the point that we all live in drainage basins, right? So what happens in Las Vegas, I guess stays in Las Vegas, but what happens at the headwaters of a drainage basin does not stay at the headwaters of a drainage basin. And a location-specific decision that you make, let's say to permit deforestation, deforestation of an upland, and you create a plantation of some type, or you create cropland, that's going to be creating either sediment or pesticides or nitrogen leaking into the rivers that then drain into the lake or the ocean or whatever. Just remember, this stuff is interconnected, so a local scale decision might not be like Las Vegas. In many cases, it's not. It reverberates to other parts of the system. So I guess what we're trying to do here is to create some awareness. It's just like the climate change question. What can I do about carbon? What can I do about maybe using a bicycle? What can I do about trying to sequester carbon, out of a power station? Or what can I do maybe converting to a different kind of a fuel type? Or what if I put solar panels? All great decisions. They're all fantastic decisions. But at the end of the day, it's a global scale phenomenon. And I think there has to be, of course, think globally, act local. It's that old adage. It really does make sense. The idea is that your local scale problem is unique to you, and you've got to study it as a local scale problem. But you have to understand that the accumulated impact of those millions of decisions, if they're wrong decisions, produces big areas of red where you shouldn't see red. We shouldn't, in the United States and Canada, we shouldn't see red. That seems to be, to my mind, just a really peculiar byproduct of not knowing what we're doing. The places where you don't see red is like sub-Saharan Africa, where there's no development. So if you're a fish, go to sub-Saharan Africa. Avoid southern France. Okay, so anyway, I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
To water problems, people can either do nothing. There can be business-based answers, or we can throw more money at it. And the other option, I think, in some cases, perhaps, because water is the new oil, war. Do you see any of that happening in the near future in any parts of the world?
War, I don't see happening, and I think that's an overblown concept. If you look at the literature on water cooperation, in particular internationally, there are lots of treaties that have been signed. Level-headed, probably water scientists have come to their governments and say, hey, we can manage this. And there are lots of treaties. And in fact, the history of the last century is one of basically keeping the peace over water. And I've heard stories where the Palestinians and Israelis, as war was raging between them, the water engineers and scientists would go to a knoll between the two countries and sit down at a picnic table and hammer out the agreements peacefully. And so I don't think war is in the opposite. But I think, again, it's this idea that decisions will be made. Whether we continue on a path that we're already on and continue, might be the de facto choice. I mean, it might just be the way it goes. We're used to doing things the way we've always done, and we might just muddle along. And that probably would be, I would say, put your money on that as the best guess, because it takes a lot more energy and time and intellectual hand waving and yelling and screaming to get people to do things differently. We don't like change. And like I said, we're always looking behind us. And perhaps one way to continue to kind of imbue a level of urgency is to maybe build scenarios. That might actually be local scale scenarios. I can build global scale scenarios, and I could show you that there's going to be more. Actually, what I can show you is that there's not going to be more red. But business as usual means there's going to be deeper reds and maybe black colors. Things are just going to get worse where they're bad already now if there's business as usual. And I think what we can do is we could perhaps develop narratives. And Terry O'Reilly of Under the Influence at the radio, he spoke to us at the CWN banquet yesterday. And he said, you've got to create dialogue. That's how you get engaged with people. They like to hear stories. I think we could probably embark on some storytelling about what the future would look like. Maybe not using futuristic cities or anything like that, but using places on Earth where that stuff has happened, and just simply translate that to where it looks like it's going to happen if you don't do something about it. And you could actually interview people who've lived through it. And you could say, well, this is what we're going to have to deal with if we don't have a change to the way we do business. I don't have any silver bullets, and as I say, I'm cautiously pessimistic. I am cautiously pessimistic, but willing to become optimistic if we see some change. But the maps I've shown you, I would think that we've been trying to do this in sort of the environmental movement for 35, 40 years. You would think that it would have taken a chink out of some of that red. It doesn't seem to have done so. And I don't know, in this next century, I just wonder out loud, what are we going to value, economic development or protecting these resources? Hopefully we can do both, but it's really a race between those two stories, isn't it? I mean, it's a dialogue that we have to have with the body politic. So anyway, I hope I answered that question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You gave us a lot of material to reflect on. With that, I would like to thank Charles again for his wonderful talk. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.